Hey guys, what's going on? So this week is UFC Fight Night Edwards versus Brady in London. This is actually a really stacked card and has some sneaky good fights on here, so I'm really excited to dive straight into my predictions, and let's just jump straight into the prelims. And the first fight, opening up the prelims, we have Guram Kutateladze versus Kaue Fernandes. Kutateladze is coming off a recent win over Jordan Vucenic, who's actually fighting further up on this card, so that's a pretty good sign. Before that, he got finished by Elves Brenner, but before Brenner sort of found that finish, I actually had it Kutateladze winning, and if it did go the cards, I'm pretty sure he actually probably would have won that one. And then even early in his career, he fought Mateusz Gamrot and won a decision win over him. Granted, it was a very close fight, and a lot of people actually said Gamrot won, but the fact that he's sort of fought this level competition is a pretty good sign, and he's also Georgian, so if you want to bet on that, Georgians have had a pretty good year this year. Delice won, Marab dominated Umar. Moving on, Kaue Fernandes, he's very early in his career. He only has 2 fights within the UFC and is 1-for-1. He had a pretty good knockout, or not even knockout, it was like a TKO against Muhammad Yahya. But outside of that, I haven't seen anything impressive from him so far, and I just think Kutateladze has had more impressive performances, so I'm going to go with Guram Kutateladze by a decision win. And moving up the card, we have Nathan Fletcher versus Caolan Loughran. Now, Nathan Fletcher, he came from the season of Tough with Shevchenko versus Grasso, and he actually lost to Khan Olfi on that season, which, at the time, pretty bad loss, but with age, Khan Olfi is decent. I actually rate him a bit for the featherweight division. And then after that fight, he actually bounced back within the UFC and got a second round arm triangle finish. So he's very good on the feet, but also he presents a grappling threat on the floor with the ability to submit people. Caolan Loughran, he lost to both Hadley and Lapulus somewhat recently, which in themselves aren't bad losses, especially Lapulus. I thought he was really good for the division. But both these fights, he didn't really show much skill or potential, and he has this recurring issue where in the later rounds he'll slow down and let his opponent sort of outstrike him and rack up points, which in the end will cause a decision loss for him. He will throw in some takedowns, and he beat Pacheco through wrestling, but he doesn't really present a submission threat like Fletcher does, and for that reason I can see Fletcher sort of slowing Loughran down throughout the rounds and then submitting him while they're wrestling near the end. So my prediction will be Nathan Fletcher by round 3 submission. Next up on the prelims, we have Shauna Bannon versus Puja Tomar. Now, both of these fighters are coming off wins, but the wins that they did get most recently are both split decisions, and both of them really could be argued their opponents won. Starting off with Bannon, her most recent fight at 304 wasn't really that impressive. She didn't really show any dominance, and when it came to deciding who the winner of that fight was, it was really hard to score. Her fight before that, going off that, she lost to Bruna Brazil, which isn't a good sign, especially when your next win isn't dominant. Puja Tomar, same case. She went to a very close decision with Ryan dos Santos, and there was some really inconsistent scoring when it came to that split decision, so it is a bit controversial whether she actually won that one. But overall, I just think she's better on the feet. So I'm just going to say that Puja Tomar is going to take this one by a decision. She's also underdog, so I guess it's better value too if you want to bet on one, but I wouldn't. Next fight on the card. Next up on the card is Christian Leroy Duncan versus Andrey Pulyaev. Duncan has a lot of finishes sort of earlier in the fights, mainly in the second round. And you see him sort of performing the best early on in his fights. One common trend you do see though is he starts to sort of taper off near the later rounds and sort of lets people run away with the second and third round and win the fight based off sort of volume. We saw that in the case of his 304 fight against Robocop, which I thought he won the first, but then just sort of let the fight run away from him. But he is really nice on the feet, and when he's fighting someone that doesn't really threaten to mix in takedowns, he does really well. Moving on to Andrey Pulyaev. He looked really good on his feet in his Contender Series bout with Leon Anderson, and he did get a really decisive decision win victory there. But he hasn't really had his chin tested, and at some moments you will see sort of these windows and these moments of weakness where he could potentially leave himself open to being finished early on. And for that reason, I feel like Christian Leroy Duncan will take advantage of this, and I think he will finish Pulyaev in the second round KO. Up next is Marcin Tybura versus Mick Parkin. Marcin Tybura, he's been a bit on and off recently. His key to winning in most cases will be sort of mixing in takedowns and ground and pound, and maybe even threatening a few submission attempts, and a lot of heavyweights don't really know how to deal with that. And we saw that in sort of the Gennaro Diniz fight and the Tai Tuivasa fight, where he sort of beat on Diniz while he was on the ground and submitted Tuivasa when he got him down on his back. But on his feet, he'll just get brutalized. And you see that with the Tom Aspinall fight, which, speaking of, Mick Parkin, he trains out at Aspinall's gym, which is a bad sign for Tybura. And, you know, most likely for this fight, he will be getting Aspinall to sort of help him matchup-wise when it comes to Tybura, who Aspinall has beat before, so he will know sort of the keys to beating him. Outside of that, everyone coming out of Aspinall's gym right now has shown some huge potential as of late, and, you know, prime example being Modestas Bukauskas. He recently, you know, has gotten some amazing first-round knockouts. And yeah, so Mick Parkin, I think he sort of has some more impressive wins. In fact, he beat Muhammad Usman and Lucas Brzeski, so I value those when it comes to his record, and I think that he is just going to finish Tybura, and I think he's going to do that one in the first round. Moving on, we have Loughran Kavanagh versus Filipe dos Santos. Now, Loughran Kavanagh, early on in his career, especially on the regional scene, everyone was hyping him up as like the next big thing. Everyone thought he was going to absolutely murder everyone once he gets into the UFC, and on the Contender Series, he did look really, really good. But, you know, he came round 4 in December on the Macau card. No, sorry, November, late November, on the Macau card. And his performance was less than stellar. He won, and he sort of did deserve to win, but it wasn't at all a sort of one-way dominant performance that everyone was expecting. It didn't even end in a finish, which everyone thought would happen. And that's the thing. I think ever since moving to the UFC and finding this higher comp, he's become a lot less dominant in his fights, and he definitely just doesn't finish as much anymore. So that's a bit concerning, but he is a good striker on the feet, and I do rate his striking ability. Filipe dos Santos, he lost to both Manel Cap and Andrey Lima, which aren't bad losses in themselves, but in those fights he did get dominated, and especially when he'd get taken to the ground, he just would have no answer and just get battered on the ground. Same thing with Altamirano, except he actually won that fight, but during that fight he got taken down 9 times, and only really won through a close split decision just by edging out on the feet. And overall, I just see a large hole in his game when it comes to his grappling ability, and I don't think he's really that strong on the feet either, to the point where Loughran Kavanagh can't overcome. Now, I don't think Kavanagh's actually going to try and grapple with him, but I think on the feet, Kavanagh just has a better striking, and for that reason, I'm going to say that Loughran Kavanagh's going to win this one by a decision. And closing out the prelims, we have Jai Herbert versus Chris Padilla. Now, Jai Herbert, he's very, very good on the feet, and he was doing decently in that Ilya fight that everyone knows him from, but as everyone knows him from, he got finished in the second round of that fight pretty brutally. But, you know, I thought he was holding his own decently in that first fight on the feet. On the ground, not so much. Ilya did take him down and sort of dominated him on the ground, but outside of that, he was doing well. Other than that, he has been on sort of a streak of decision wins and losses. He won against Carl Nelson, then lost to Frezian, both by decisions, and then drew with Ludovic Klein, once again, decision. So it is a bit dodgy, that, but, you know, he's a really good striker. Chris Padilla, he beat up on Rongzhu. Like, this was a brutal showing where he just sort of pounded the same side of Rongzhu's head over and over until the doctor had to come in and stop it in the second round, I think. Before that, he took Lontop to the ground and submitted him in the first round, which is probably a good move with Lontop considering its chin, but overall I think he's shown that he is well rounded, and his wrestling credentials definitely outmastered Jai Herbert's by a long shot. And for this reason, I think that, you know, if it does go to decision, Jai Herbert will sort of outstrike Chris Padilla. But I think Chris Padilla has that ground advantage, and I could 100% see Chris Padilla taking Jai Herbert to the ground and submitting him. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Chris Padilla, and I'm going to say that he's going to get a round 2 submission. And moving on to the main card and opening the main card, we have Nathaniel Wood versus Morgan Charriere. Now, Nathaniel Wood has some really solid wins at featherweight. He beat both Charles Jourdain and Andrey Fili by decision wins, where he showed a decently good performance. And his key to victory more times than not is trying just to out-volume and damage opponents on the feet and mix in some takedowns when he sees the opportunity, but on the ground he won't really submit or finish. He'll just sort of maintain dominant position in ground and pound. Morgan Charriere is a very scary prospect. He is on a pretty good winning streak, and he got really early finishes in 2 of his 3 most recent fights. He did get a close split decision with Chet Mariscal, and he was sort of unable to put Mariscal away. But at the same time, Mariscal has a stupidly good chin and can take a ridiculous amount of punishment, so I don't blame him, but that fight was a lot closer than it definitely should have been. And in that fight, he actually showed a bit of grappling proficiency, which sort of helped him push that win. And overall, I just think Charriere is better on the feet and has a slight advantage on the ground. Maybe not, but either way, I think that he'll get this one done, and I think that he'll get it done in the second round by a knockout. And moving up the card, we have Jordan Vucenic versus Chris Duncan. Now, jumping straight into Jordan Vucenic, he lost his first fight in the UFC to Guram Kutateladze. He got both outstruck and outgrappled in that fight, and it was a pretty close fight, with Guram ultimately taking the win, but at the end of the day, Guram sort of dominated him throughout the majority of that fight, and it was also somewhat concerning because in the regional scene, he was touted and known for sort of his submission attempts and his first round submission finishes, as well as his grappling and how proficient he was on the ground. And I guess that just sort of showed how it didn't really transition well when moving to the UFC and that higher skill ceiling. Granted, I do think he is a really good wrestler. I think he has really good ground game, and I think it's definitely going to be a threat in this fight. Chris Duncan, he won recently by choking out Balaji with a guillotine from bottom position, and that was in the first round of the fight, and he actually put him out, and the ref didn't even notice until a bit later when he sort of ducked his head down. Outside of that, he did get submitted by Manuel Torres in the first round, so 1-for-1 on the submissions, and it's kind of hard to tell how his grappling will pair up against Vucenic's. But I do think Duncan is overall better on the feet, and I do like how he mixes up his striking with occasional wrestling. He's not afraid to get takedowns, and on the floor he can hold his own. So for that reason, I think that Chris Duncan's just going to take it to a decision and end up doing a bit more and winning. Next on the main card, we have Molly Mccann versus Alexia Thaionara. Molly Mccann is on a weird streak recently, and it's really hard to predict her fights. She lost 2 of her fights somewhat recently back to back to first round submission losses, and then out of nowhere she just comes back and gets a round 1 submission win over Belbita. And right when you think that she's sort of gotten this ground game proficiency, she loses to Bruna Brazil again, where she gets beat up on the feet, and then as soon as it goes to the ground she just doesn't show any success there either. So I don't know, I just can't really rely on Mccann to consistently win. Her opponent, Alexia Thaionara, she beat up her opponent badly on the Contender Series. That was a very dominant win. And then not much else to go on, but in her regional scene, she has shown really proficient grappling and a few submission wins, which is kind of worrying because Mccann has a tendency to get taken down and submitted within her fights. And it's for that reason, I think that Alexia Thaionara is going to win this one. Is it going to be by submission? I don't think so. I'm going to say it's going to be by a decision win, but it could be. Yeah, next fight. And it's here that we arrive at Gunnar Nelson versus Kevin Holland. Now, I'm going to keep this first section brief because there's no need to explain much. Gunnar Nelson, really good wrestler, really good ground game. He likes wrestling. He likes taking it to the ground. He'll submit a few people every now and then, usually very early in the fight. And if he doesn't submit you, he'll take you to the decision and just win based off ground control and sort of damage from ground and pound. Kevin Holland, out of his 5 most recent fights, he's lost 4 of them. So breaking that down, his 5th last fight was against JDM. That was a very close fight. Went to a split decision. JDM won. I thought he won. It wasn't really that controversial. Moving on at 299, Kevin Holland takes on MVP, and MVP wins that one as well. It's a pure striking match, and Kevin's style is pretty unpredictable and matches up pretty well with MVP. So it was somewhat close, but MVP sort of dominated him for all 3 rounds. So it went to decision, and he won. Moving on, 303. Kevin Holland takes on Olasejczyk, and he actually wins this one by an armbar at the end of the first round and breaks Olasejczyk's arm. But I do think Olasejczyk was dominating that first round, and I do think if it went to round 2 and 3, Olasejczyk would have actually won that one, but that's just my speculation. Turns around for 307, takes on Roma Delice, and it's during the end of the first round where Delice is applying top pressure on Kevin Holland, and Kevin Holland sort of rolls over in pain and claims he's broken a rib. And at the time I was thinking, man, that sucks. That's not really like a win for Delice because it was sort of like a accidental injury. But then out of nowhere, a couple of months later, it gets announced that he's turning around again from 307 to fight at UFC 301 in January, and he's fighting Reina Derrida. And I'm thinking, hold on, surely he didn't break a rib and is doing a 3-month turnaround. But regardless, 301 rolls around and then he's scheduled to fight Reina de Ritter. He loses that one instantly, gets submitted within the first round, and this is my problem with Holland. He just turns around too quickly. It seems like he doesn't really care about winning as much anymore. He's just sort of doing it to rack up as many fights in the year as possible. And the minute his back touches the ground, he just loses fights. He has negative fighter IQ when he's on the ground. And for that reason, obviously, I think Gunnar Nelson's going to win by a 45-70. No, I'm kidding. He's going to get round 1 sub. And until we arrive at the co-main event, Jan Blachowicz versus Carlos Ulberg. Ooh, this is a good fight. Jan Blachowicz, recently he's been on a bit of a weird streak where he'll keep getting these decision wins. Back in the day, he used to be sort of this unstoppable knockout force. He had incredible power on him, but you know, from Izzy to Ankalaev to Pereira, he's sort of gone to more and more decisions recently, which makes me think this fight might. Arguably he actually beat Pereira. A lot of people can argue that. A lot of people will argue the Pereira one. It's sort of, I had it for Jan actually, but I see how Pereira won that one. It's not like a robbery. I'm not going to scream robbery at that. But yeah, as he's increased in age, he's just going to more and more decisions that are getting sort of closer and closer, and I think this is sort of signaling the sort of retirement status that he's at soon. Carlos Ulberg, he had a really mean streak between 2022 and 2024 where he was getting these consistent back-to-back first round knockouts, and he looked like an unstoppable prospect, a sort of powerhouse that will finish you really quickly in the fight if you're not careful. And then we sort of got to see this more technical, slower side of Ulberg when he fought Odesmir at the UFC Macau card, I think it was, where he wasn't really blitzing in as much. He was sort of being a bit slower and sort of watching for these counters. And I think this is what we'll see here. I don't think he's going to try and finish Jan, because why would you? Jan's got a chin of steel, like I wouldn't even try. So that's what makes me think it's going to go decision. Jan could finish Ulberg. I could 100% see that. Jan could still have that power in him. I doubt it, but we could see it. But overall, I just think Ulberg's a higher volume fighter. He'll sort of outstrike Jan, and Jan might take a bit to get into the fight, and even still, he just won't do enough to take home a decision win. So for that reason, I'm going to predict that Carlos Ulberg will take this one by a decision win. Granted, I think this one's going to be very close. And the main event, Leon Edwards versus Sean Brady. Now, starting off with Leon Edwards, he's just recently been separated from the belt by Bilal Muhammad at 304, where he kind of got dominated. I had it 5-0 Bilal. You could argue that Leon won the last round, sort of with the last 30 seconds raining down those elbow ground and pounds and cutting Bilal open. But either way, it was a pretty bad loss for Leon. As a champ, he had a pretty good reign. He, of course, got the belt off Kamaru Usman in one of the most well-known head kicks in the UFC. And then he got 2 defenses, one against Usman in the rematch where he sort of dominated, I'd say, most of the fight. There were bits where Usman was sort of coming back a little bit, but just wasn't enough. And then he won against Colby Covington for a second defense where Colby just didn't look like himself, and he came in with a broken foot, but overall it was an impressive win for Leon. And I think that consistently throughout his career, his main key to victory is just sort of outstriking on the feet. He knows he has good striking, and more times than not, he'll just sort of rely on his striking to get him a decision win. Granted, when he does fight wrestlers, the decisions start getting a lot closer. Like when he fought Gunnar Nelson sort of mixed in these takedowns and held him to the ground. And that went to a split decision that Leon just edged out. So I'm a bit worried when it comes to Leon's grappling. Speaking of, Sean Brady, I don't think that Leon can out-grapple Sean Brady. So the key to this fight for Leon would be keeping him on the feet. But even so, I think Sean Brady possesses a pretty good striking threat. In his most recent performances, he sort of outstruck Gilbert Burns, he outstruck Kelvin Gastelum, he outstruck Jake Matthews. Granted, a lot of these strikes came from the ground, but even on the feet, if you look at the stats, he was actually outstriking all 3 of these fighters. But it's a bit hard to tell with Brady's striking ability because he is one of Bilal Muhammad's only TKO wins. So I don't know. Maybe he isn't great. Maybe Bilal's just amazing at striking. It's really hard to tell at this point. But where Brady shines, I think, is his ground game, where he'll sort of take you down, hold you there, and get these ground and pound strikes. And it might even threaten a few submissions, and he does have a few submission victories, like over Jake Matthews and Kelvin Gastelum. But I think his main key to winning this fight is holding Leon Edwards to the ground and sort of winning via ground and pound, or even, I could see a submission, but I doubt it, but even submitting him. So that's for the reason why I'm going to pick Sean Brady, and I think he's going to get this one done by a decision win. And that's it, guys. Those were my predictions for UFC Fight Night Edwards versus Brady. On screen now, you know the drill. All of my predictions and all of Cam's predictions for this event. Overall, this card I'm really excited for, way more excited than last week. Even though last week's was really fun to watch, going into it I couldn't say I was exactly pumped. This one has a lot more star power. The main event's amazing. The fact that they have a #1 contender in a main event on a fight night is crazy. And then co-main as well is really, really fun. And even on the prelims, you have sneakily good fights, like Mick Parkin's fighting, Herbert's fighting on the early prelims. Oh, not early prelims, just regular prelims. Guram Kutateladze's opening up the fight night, which I think is pretty decent. Leroy, Duncan. Overall, this card's fucking fun as hell. So I'm really excited. Recap video is going to be fun to make for this as well. So yeah, bye bye.